All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're doing something wild. We're going to try and pack thousands of years of European history into one single story. So let's jump right in and trace this incredible journey.
So, how did this one relatively small continent end up shaping, well, the entire modern world? It's a huge question, right? Well, we're going to tackle it by diving into the epic story of Europe. And what you'll see is this recurring theme, this cycle of collapse and rebirth, of conflict and then cooperation.
So here's our roadmap. We'll start with the classical cradle, move through faith and fragmentation, rebirth and revolution, the crazy age of extremes, and finally land on the contested unity of today.
All right, part one, the classical cradle. You know, to really understand Europe, we have to go way, way back to the ancient civilizations that literally forged the foundations for everything to come.
So, for a huge chunk of time, like tens of thousands of years, early humans are just adapting. Then, boom, the agricultural revolution hits. It's a game changer, and it leads to these amazing early civilizations like the Minoans. But then, and this is a huge mystery, around 1200 BCE, this entire advanced Bronze Age world just collapses. It's plunged into a dark age. But you know, out of that darkness, a new light flickers on in Greece. The Greek city-states pop up, and they start cooking up these ideas that become the absolute cornerstones of Western civilization. I mean, we're talking about democracy, philosophy, science, stuff we are still arguing about and building on today.
And then, of course, after Greece comes Rome. And the Romans, they were on another level. They weren't just about conquering, they were about unifying. They built this massive empire, almost 6 million square kilometers at its peak. They spread their laws, their language, their incredible engineering all over the place, creating this long period of relative peace called the Pax Romana.
Okay, so part two, faith and fragmentation. Because as we all know, no empire lasts forever. When Rome fell, it didn't just fall, it shattered European unity. And into that void stepped a powerful new force that would define the continent for the next 1,000 years: faith. So, after 476 AD, when the last emperor in the West gets the boot, Europe basically splits down the middle. In the West, you get chaos. It fragments into all these so-called barbarian kingdoms. But in the East, the Roman Empire doesn't really fall. It just morphs into the Byzantine Empire, a total powerhouse that keeps the old traditions alive.
And in that power vacuum in the West, you have these Germanic tribes, the Franks, the Visigoths, the Angles and Saxons, carving up the old empire. It's a messy, chaotic time. And the only thing really holding it all together, the only source of stability, literacy, and law, the Christian church.
Okay, now this is where it gets really interesting. You've got to picture Europe being pulled in all these different directions at once. From the south, you have the rise of Islam expanding into Spain. From the north, boom, the Viking Age kicks off. And from the east, you have new states like the Kievan Rus popping up. The continent was just this cauldron of competing forces.
All right, let's move on to rebirth and revolution. So after all that chaos, things start to calm down. Europe starts growing again, but then it gets hit by one of the worst disasters in human history. And here's the crazy part. That very disaster, paradoxically, is what sets the stage for a cultural explosion that will completely change the world. So that disaster, the Black Death. We're talking about a plague that wiped out maybe a third of Europe's entire population. Just devastating. But here's the twist. In the aftermath, all this wealth gets concentrated in the hands of the survivors, especially in Italian city-states, and that wealth fuels the Renaissance, this incredible rebirth of art, science, and classical ideas. And if the Renaissance was the new software, this was the hardware that let it run, the printing press. Seriously, it's hard to overstate what a game changer this was. Before Gutenberg, books were copied by hand, slow, expensive, super rare. Afterwards, you could mass-produce ideas, and that meant radical new thoughts could spread like wildfire, challenging the one institution nobody thought you could challenge, the church. And here's a perfect example. In 1517, this monk, Martin Luther, has some critiques of the church. In the old days, maybe a few people hear about it, but with the printing press, his ideas go viral. And that spark ignites the Protestant Reformation, which completely shatters the religious unity of Western Europe and leads to more than 100 years of incredibly brutal wars over faith. So you have all this conflict and division at home. At the same time, you've got new technologies, like better ships and navigation. what happens? Europeans start looking outward. This kicks off the age of discovery. And while it connected the globe in a way it never had been before, let's be clear, it was built on building these massive global empires, on exploiting resources, and on the absolute horror of the transatlantic slave trade.
Next up, the age of extremes. Because if you thought the religious wars were intense, well, things are about to get even crazier. We're talking about a period that unleashed both unbelievable progress and destruction on a scale nobody could have ever imagined. It's like a cascade of revolutions, one knocking over the next. First, you get the scientific revolution, which teaches people to think based on reason and evidence. That leads directly to the Enlightenment, where people start asking, hey, why do kings get to rule? Those questions fuel the French Revolution. And while all this political chaos is happening, the Industrial Revolution is completely turning society upside down.
So you take all these new ideas like nationalism, you mix it with the incredible power of industrial factories, and you add in a century of imperial competition, and you've basically built a giant powder keg. And in the 20th century, it exploded. Twice. First with World War I, which just shattered the old empires, and then, only 20 years later, World War II, a conflict that left the entire continent in ruins.
And you'd think after all that devastation, there'd be peace, right? Nope. What came next was a new kind of war, a cold one. As Winston Churchill so famously put it, an iron curtain came down, splitting Europe in two. On one side, you had the democratic West, allied with the US. On the other, the communist East, dominated by the Soviet Union. And that standoff would define the next 40 years.
Okay, last section, a contested unity. Because here's where the story takes another surprising turn. Out of the absolute rubble and ashes of World War II, a brand new and frankly a totally radical idea starts to emerge in Western Europe. The idea was this: what if we tie our economies, our futures, so closely together that another war between us becomes not just unlikely, but literally unthinkable?
And it started small, really small, just an agreement about coal and steel between a few countries. But it grew. It evolved into an economic community. And then the really huge moment came in 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell. That ended the Cold War and opened the door for what would become the European Union to expand east, basically reuniting the continent for the first time in decades.
But let's be honest, this road to unity has been anything but smooth. I mean, just look at the last few decades. You had the horrific breakup of Yugoslavia in the 90s, the huge financial crisis in 2008 that really tested everyone's solidarity. You had Brexit, with the UK deciding to leave, and now, tragically, major war is back in Europe. It just goes to show you the forces of division are still incredibly powerful. And that really brings us right up to today. What is Europe now? Well, it's this fascinating patchwork. It's a continent of independent countries that are more linked, more intertwined than at any point in history. But they're constantly wrestling with that core tension, the push towards greater integration versus the pull of their own national identities.
You know, if there's one thing this whole story shows us, it's that Europe's history is one long repeating cycle of crisis and then transformation. Which, of course, leaves us with a big question, doesn't it? As the continent faces the challenges of today, what new reality is going to emerge? What on earth will define Europe's next chapter?